This week we're going to talk about the rebirth of witchcraft. So last week we talked about witchcraft in the medieval period and in the early modern period. And this week it's on to the Enlightenment and the 19th century. Here we have a picture of Circe holding the cup for Ulysses, which was a pre-Raphaelite painting, and we will see that the Pre-Raphaelites were part of a broader fascination with witchcraft and the occult in the 19th century. So last time we finished up with the 1735 Witchcraft Act, which Ronald Hutton memorably described as a heavy-handed piece of Enlightenment rationalism that sought to discredit the existence of witchcraft. And you could actually be punished under the 1735 Act for pretending to be a witch. Not for being a witch, but for pretending to be a witch. However, this was more likely to result in imprisonment than in torture and death, so obviously an improvement. And in fact, the last person to be prosecuted under this act, very famously, was Helen Duncan, the spiritualist in 1943, I think, during the middle of the war. But obviously that is outside the period we're going to look at today. But I thought I'd start off with where we left off because it's kind of important for what comes next. So from during the 18th century, the period known, we have the period known as the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment took different forms in different countries, and it was characterized by rationalism, a move away from Christianity. Like, it was actually acceptable to be an atheist in the 18th century, and they were very interested in ancient Greece, and there was a lot of talk of getting back to nature and experiencing the beauty of nature. It was at this time during the 18th century that the Druid Revival got going. So people became very interested in what the ancient Britons did, and there was a fairly interesting theory that the ancient Britons somehow had a connection with the ancient Israelites, and that we might even be the lost tribe of Israel or something. And people were trying to get back to the original religion, the religion, and so they were looking for sort of a monotheism, but maybe a pantheism. So the idea that the divine was immanent in nature, and there was also a lot of deism around at this time, which was the idea that basically deism is the idea that God lit the blue touch paper on the universe and then retired from it to a safe distance to watch the fireworks. The Freemasons were in effect deists, and there was a lot of links between Freemasonry and the Druids. And towards the latter end of the period, we have a lot of people becoming interested in the Gothic. And the illustration I've chosen for this slide is a picture of Strawberry Hill House in Twickenham, which, if you ever get a chance to visit, is really amazing because it's absolutely full of Gothic vaulting and amazing paintwork, and just, it's just fabulous. But this was part of a wider movement. We had Humphrey Repton, who had kind of taken over as the gardener to the fashionable and wealthy from Capability Brown, going around creating Gothic grottos and Gothic follies and things in people's country gardens, like massive country estates where they could afford to kind of completely remodel the landscape. And it's fashionable to have like a hermit or a druid living in the middle of a fake stone circle in your vast country estate, so that when people came to visit, they could see your hermit. So there was the start of a fascination with the uncanny, the Gothic, and it's at this time, of course, we get the novel Frankenstein, by Mary Shelley, which is preoccupied with the themes of the Enlightenment, but we're starting to get the ideas of the Romantics in that it's all about science, but then it's kind of, ooh, science could go bad and scary, and we could resurrect dead people. Ooh, scary. So we start to get a turn towards the occult at this point. Okay, another aspect of this is the fairy faith, and there were remnants of small p pagan belief in rural Ireland, rural Scotland and rural Wales. And this book on the right was a compendium of fairy lore that was written down by one Robert Kirk, who was a minister of the church in Scotland. And it wasn't actually published until 1890, so it was languishing in manuscript form for 200 years before it actually got published. But it's a really fascinating book that goes into all kinds of detail about how you could see fairies, who had been to visit the fairy realms, and seers who had special stones that they could see the fairies through, like a hagstone, and the fairy flag of Dunvegan, and all sorts of other exciting things. It's a great book to get hold of. And here we have the manuscript, which actually says 1692 on it. Interesting. The actual manuscript from Robert Kirk, with the incredibly long title that was fashionable in the 18th century. So the belief in fairies was still pretty widespread, and there was quite a lot of connection between fairy lore and witch lore. So a couple of important names in this field would be Arthur Evans Wentz, who wrote The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, and of course W.B. Yeats, who wrote a lot of poetry about fair folk and was a member of the Golden Dawn, and wrote his own treatise on the occult called A Vision, and did automatic writing with his wife George, and was generally very interested in this whole area. Okay, so following on from the Enlightenment, we have the period of Romanticism, and I've chosen this picture to illustrate this slide because it is the picture that everyone thinks of when that epitomizes what Romanticism was all about. So here we have the lonely traveller surveying the landscape. The landscape is all mysterious and anything might happen. There's the fog. It's all a bit melancholy. This essentially captures the themes of Romanticism really well. So the early phase of Romanticism was called Sturm und Drang, and it basically means storm and stress. So the early Romantic period was characterized by a lot of people who were very interested in revolution, and the late Enlightenment, early Romantics kind of rushed off to Paris to hang out with the Paris Commune and take part in the French Revolution. They later a bit disillusioned by all of that. And during the 19th century, we actually have a turn back. Like I said, in the Enlightenment, there was a bit of an interest in paganism. In the early 19th century, people were turning back towards Christianity. Romanticism was looking for a more spiritual form of Christianity, and this tied in with other movements like the Methodist movement, which was trying to create a more social form of Christianity, like with a social conscience and less Calvinism and more actual engagement with spirituality. So we still have this strong interest in spirituality, but a Christian spirituality mostly. One of the key things that ties the late Enlightenment to the early Romantics is the concept of the sublime. Now, the sublime should be sort of contrasted with the bucolic. So the bucolic is like, I'm flitting about in the meadows and I'm having a nice time, and it's all very sweet and pastoral and kind of, you know, the lowlands, lots of nice farmland, sort of very tame countryside. Whereas the sublime is all about, there's a big scary mountain and it's really wild and it's full of wolves and a storm might come over the hill at any moment, and it's all very exciting, and you're gazing at the chasm of the waterfall and the big pointy spiky mountain or the dark forest, and you know there might be the Lorelei might come out of the Rhine at any minute and lure you to your death. So you've got this sort of sense of awe in response to the sublime, and that's really what the Romantics were really interested in, and that's why Wordsworth and Coleridge and all that gang basically went, Lake District, let's go to the Lake District because it's full of mountains and big sky and you know, lots of sublimity. Previously people didn't really like that kind of countryside because they liked the settled pastoral lowland areas where they weren't going to meet any wolves or anything scary that might eat them. And suddenly people are like, oh, really interested in these very wild places. And this is a new thing for the Romantics, and quite a substantial change of attitude to wilderness. And obviously you can see how that ties in with themes of witchcraft, because witches are all about the wilderness and connecting with nature. And you know, we get the phrase nature red in tooth and claw from a late romantic poet, Alfred Lord Tennyson, because he was interested in this aspect of romanticism. Okay, so another strand in how we get to the Witchcraft Revival is all the folklore collectors. So during the 19th century, a lot of countries suddenly became really interested in their own ethnographical lore. So lots of folklore collectors start going out into the countryside. I mean, think about the Brothers Grimm, who collected all their fairy, folk tales during the 19th century. Here we have a group of Jewish folklore collectors in Warsaw in 1931. I hope they all made it out safely. Finland, you have Elias Lönnrot collecting the Kalevala, and then Sibelius composing the music of Finlandia and the other music which was inspired by the Kalevala. So everybody's doing it, everybody's out there collecting their ethnic folklore, reviving their ethnic languages, and really getting back to nature. Now, sadly, there's both a left-wing contingent of folklorists and a right-wing contingent of folklorists. So the left-wing ones were very interested, sort of more interested in the working class, and there weren't actually that many of them, unfortunately. Well, there must have been some, because we'll see some more about them in the next slide. Unfortunately, there were also right-wing folklore collectors who were basically looking for the pure ethnic folklore of their own people, and they certainly weren't interested in anyone else. There was an excellent article I saw recently where it was pointed out that Cecil Sharp and Maud Carpeles were, when they were running around the Appalachians, doing a really fine job of collecting English folk ballads that had made their way over to the Appalachians, basically ignored and were very rude about the art and the music of black people who happened to be there, to the extent that they actually used the N-word to describe them. Thankfully, There was in the 20s and 30s, there was a wonderful guy called Alan Lomax who went around and collected a lot of blues songs. So there was somebody, thankfully, who was interested in black folklore and music and did go around and collect those. Few, because that would have been a great loss if those things hadn't been collected. But anyway, so the general tendency is everyone's interested in folklore and, of course, witchcraft beliefs and fairy beliefs and the idea of being in touch with the land is all very much part of folklore. So this is a worldwide revival. And emerging kind of at the same time and in connection with it, and many of the same people being involved, we have the Occult Revival. So the Freemasons really got going in the late 17th century. And a lot of these other occult orders were spin-offs from the Freemasons in some way. I once jokingly said that you could summarize 19th century occult history by saying, first of all, there were some Freemasons, and well, some of them got a bit bored and went and founded Druidry, and then there were some more Freemasons, and some of them got a bit bored and went and founded the Golden Dawn, and then later on there were some more Freemasons, and some of them got a bit bored and went and founded Wicca, and which, you know, it's kind of leaves out a vast amount of detail, but it's broadly true. Right, so basically, anyway, to put a bit more detail into that, we have the Freemasons, who, as I said, were founded in the late 17th century, and they really get going. They start out in an upper room of a pub, and it's not very long before, you know, everyone who's fashionable has joined the Freemasons. Obviously you had to be male, but and then they get a very nice hall in Drury Lane and make their mark on occult history in a big way. Very important for our story of witchcraft to mention co-masonry, which is the version of Freemasonry where men and women can be in the lodge together. So don't let anyone tell you that Freemasonry is male only, because there are female versions of Freemasonry and there is a mixed gender version of Freemasonry, so i.e. co-masonry. Also very important for our story is the SRIA, or Societas Rosicrucianae in Anglia. And the Rosicrucians and the co-masons basically had a lodge in Bournemouth, well, Highcliffe to be precise, in the 1930s, which is where Gerald Gardner met the New Forest Coven. And if you want to find out more about that, you should read Philip Heselton's marvellous new book, The New Forest Coven. It's very, very good. Anyway, jumping ahead a bit there, because we're still somewhere in the middle of the 19th century and I just popped over to the 1930s. So the Golden Dawn, very important, and the Theosophical Society. And according to Alex Owen in The Place of Enchantment, which is a great history of occultism in the 19th century, basically during the sort of 1880s, 1890s, everybody who was anybody was either a member of the Golden Dawn or a member of the Theosophical Society. So Oscar Wilde was in the Theosophical Society. W.B. Yeats was in the Golden Dawn. There was Florence Farr, who was in the Golden Dawn. She was an actress. And just like everybody famous was in one or the other, because it was the thing to do. And in France, we have the very important writer Eliphas Lévi, who is responsible for the very famous drawing of Baphomet, and was like a really important occultist of the time. So the interesting thing about the Golden Dawn is that it kind of promoted the equality of women in a way that hadn't really happened before. Here we have at the top of the top picture is Mina MacGregor Mathers dressed as a rather splendid priestess, and the bottom slide is her husband, Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, dressed in Egyptian garb, because their influences were basically Kabbalah, Egyptian magic, the tarot, the Western magical tradition generally, and what they did that was really important was they kind of brought together all these different strands of occult symbolism and made a coherent system out of them. And this was very useful for, was what when Aleister Crowley wrote his compendium of magical stuff, 777, he based a lot of it on the correspondences that had been put together by the people from the Golden Dawn, because he was in the Golden Dawn originally and then he kind of got booted out. Also, the Golden Dawn had a big split in the 20s, I think. So, as occult societies tend to do. Anyway, this has been obviously kind of very light touch approach to the occultism of the 19th century. There's a great book covering the occultism of the 19th century by Gary Lachman, who is the is he the guitarist or the drummer in Blondie, anyway, and that's very interesting. I can't remember the title, but if you look up Gary Lachman and occult history, you'll find it. Okay, so another strand that was really important in the development of Wicca and witchcraft and the Witchcraft Revival in general was nature religion. And here we have a picture of Ross Nichols, the founder of the Order of Bards, Ovites and Druids, outside his meditation hut. Actually, it might be his hut at one of the nudist camps that he went to. And the bottom picture is Gerald Gardner, hard at work at his desk. And I think it was actually Ronald Hutton who discovered that they had quite often sat next to each other at 5 Acres Nudist Club and chatted about how they were going to form their new respective religions of pagan Druidry and Wicca. So that would explain why we tend to celebrate the same Wheel of the Year, although we give the festivals different names. Anyway, they were best buddies, and they both had a really great collection of tattoos as well, apparently. So I guess they sat there and talked about the occult and compared their tattoos. Anyway, pretty cool. So back to the rest of the slide. Transcendentalism. Now, Transcendentalism was a very interesting movement which arose out of Unitarianism, and it was started by Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, and Ross Nichols was fairly heavily influenced by Henry David Thoreau, especially with the whole hut thing. Like, Thoreau went and lived in a hut on Walden Pond, and Ross Nichols thought this was a splendid idea and insisted that Druids should have huts. I like the idea of a hut. Don't like Henry David Thoreau, but I like huts. Anyway, so Transcendentalism was started because Ralph Waldo Emerson read Rammohun Roy's translation of the Upanishads into English. Now, the Upanishads are a Hindu sacred text which talk about the concept of Brahman and Atman and other important concepts, which Emerson translated as the concept of the oversoul. Now, this introduced all kinds of important ideas from Hinduism into Western thought, probably for the first time. And this gave a huge boost to people looking for nature religion and alternate forms of religion. And so Transcendentalism had a big influence on alternative spirituality, basically. And it is probably the place where we get the term nature religion, according to Chas Clifton in Her Hidden Children, which is about the arrival of paganism in North America, or the revival of. Now, the neo-pagans, these were a group of students at Cambridge University around the turn of the century, and they included one Rupert Brooke, and they used to like to lie about in Grantchester Meadows chatting about paganism and being attuned with nature and so on. And unfortunately Rupert Brooke was killed in the First World War, but the neo-pagans as a group had an important influence. Now another group that were around at the same time was Edward Carpenter and his circle of friends. Now Edward Carpenter was quite a remarkable man. He was gay. He lived openly with his lover, George Merrill, and they actually inspired the novel Maurice by Edward Forster, by E.M. Forster, and E.M. Forster maintained that it was because George Merrill had touched him on the bum and it suddenly the idea came to him in a flash, apparently. If only all such moments could inspire such great literature. But anyway, Edward Carpenter wrote some stuff about paganism and how it would be great to get back to paganism. And he was best friends with Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson, who was the guy who came up with the idea for the United Nations, or the League of Nations as its first iteration was called. And they wrote about paganism and the ancient Greeks and how much they'd like to be proper pagans. I basically knew about this because I read a thing by G.K. Chesterton in which he's slagging off Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson, and I'm like, hey, I must find out more about this Lowes Dickinson bloke. But yeah, Edward Carpenter really, really important in the foundation of the Labour Party and the Fabian Society, and there's still a society dedicated to Edward Carpenter in Sheffield. And there's a very famous picture by Walter Crane of called A Garland for the Workers, in which there's a sort of goddess surrounded by grain and fruit and things, and it's saying the 8-hour day, votes for all, and things like this. And it's kind of the marriage of paganism and socialism. So around the turn of the 18th into the 19th, around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, we get the founding of more Druid orders, and this is where we start to get actual pagan Druid orders, as opposed to we're a friendly society that like to read poetry and think that the Britons were somehow connected to the ancient Hebrews, which is a nice idea, but sadly ahistorical. So we actually start to get Druids showing up to Stonehenge and thinking of themselves in connection with the Celts at this point. So it's kind of more actual pagan as opposed to kind of transcendentalism with a veneer of funny hats. So yes, and I already talked about Gerald Gardner and Ross Nichols and how important they were in the foundation of both Wicca and Druidry. So that concludes this week's talk. A lot of the ideas in this talk were based on The Triumph of the Moon by Ronald Hutton, and if you haven't read it, go buy yourself a copy immediately, because it's very, very good, and you can learn about this topic in much greater depth than I have succeeded in conveying in this brief talk. Would also highly recommend The Druids, also by Ronald Hutton, and The Place of Enchantment, British Occultism and the Culture of the Modern by Alex Owen, which I mentioned earlier. So I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode of The Witch's Mirror. I think it's a bit shorter than last week's, which I did ramble on a bit. Next time we're going to talk about, seeing as this one's called The Rebirth of Witchcraft, next time's session is called The Adolescence of Witchcraft. So until next time, blessed be, take care of yourselves, and see you soon.